Hi, I'm Abby. Most of you guys know me as Avalon, and I'm doing a writing segment for Form Fair. We haven't had a lot of writing events in the past for Form, and I'm super excited to be here with a bunch of other super talented writers today to do segments for you guys to teach you things and to present our pieces. So a little bit about me is I began slam poetry my sophomore year of high school. I've competed in 2 poetry slams, and I helped work on an anthology for the poetry program that my school ran its poetry club through. So that was a super fun experience, and it's super, super rewarding to see your work get published in an actual anthology. Investing in slam poetry has done so much for me both as a person and an artist. I'm able to articulate my words better, I have better social skills, and I like being in front of a crowd when I choose to. I don't get as nervous when I get up on stage anymore, and that's something that's super worthwhile and something that takes time, but it's super worth it to be able to present yourself and public speak. And that's what I'm going to talk about today is public speaking, because it's so incredibly daunting to so many people, and it makes sense why, especially with something like slam poetry. You're getting up on stage and presenting your art, just pouring your heart out to an audience, and you don't know how they're going to receive it. So it's completely, nerve-wracking, and it completely makes sense. We're going to go over a few things on how to, conquer that, how to get better at public speaking, how to get better at presenting your art to the world if standing on a stage and doing so makes you nervous. And I'll say that again and again throughout this. It's totally fine to be nervous. It completely makes sense. For this segment, we're going to focus on 3 things when it comes to public speaking: your voice, your hands, and your legs. And at the end of this segment, I'm going to read 2 poems.
That's a lie, I'm only reading 1.
And one from Evel Ewing's book, Electric Arches, which is a wonderful book. So with that being said, let's get into it. Maybe this is why I do slam poetry. I'm so bad at improvising. Your voice is super important because it's the actual, act of reading your piece. So be expressive. Vary your tone up and down based on what you're saying, and you might want to speak a little bit louder than you're used to. Now you're going to feel like you're yelling, like you're screaming, because you're not used to speaking at that elevated tone, but with time, you'll adjust to it. And varying your tone is super important. Reading something in a monotone voice as if you were just reading it on a piece of paper isn't as interesting as letting the energy push towards the audience or letting it lull during moments of sadness or quieter moments in the piece. So vary your tone based on what you're saying. And these things might not come naturally because it's hard to read in front of an audience and hard to be aware of so many things at once because it's performance. But baby steps are still steps. There's nothing wrong with taking small steps, as small as you need, to get where you want to be as a poet. Pacing is probably one of the most important parts of, actually speaking your poem, because we tend to rush through things when we're nervous. So you might want to step back and look at the speed at which you're reading your pieces in front of an audience. Some lines might hit harder if you read them really quickly, really frantically, and some might hit harder if you read them slowly and sort of just fall back and let the energy lull. It's just a matter of what works best for the lines you're reading and what works best for the way that you want to emote and you want to convey these emotions. Hands. Slam poetry is performance. Match the words that you're saying with hand and arm movements. Like you can do, if something's emotional, put your hands over your chest. You can do very broad, basic hand movements. You can count on your fingers if you're counting in your poem. There's so many different ways you can do this. And again, it's completely up to how you want to convey these emotions, how you feel confident in conveying these emotions, and the actual content of your poem. And I understand that it gets kind of hard because one hand might be holding your phone or your notebook, and you might be nervous and shaky. But again, with time, with baby steps, you can work on it and you can gradually get to a point where you can do bigger, broader hand motions. And it's also an incentive to memorize your pieces so that you can have more options with both of your hands at once. Legs sounds kind of funny and it sounds kind of strange because you don't expect to be doing things with your legs when you're standing on a stage and reading, but most people have sort of a nervous movement when they're on stage. Some people wring their hands, some people rock back and forth on their heels, some people sway from side to side. Even now, I still get nervous, and I've noticed that I've picked up swaying my arm that isn't holding my phone or my notebook. And that's completely normal. It's sort of your brain trying to minimize how awkward it feels to stand on stage because you feel like standing completely still is just going to make you more nervous, so your body has sort of an idle movement to keep you occupied. It's just a matter of learning to be conscious of it and learning to not do it. And that's so much easier said than done, but it is completely doable. The whole performance of slam poetry is more about your voice and your upper body. Your lower body very rarely has stuff to do with your piece, but again, it depends on the piece that you're performing. You can try to fill the space with other gestures, you can stay focused on keeping your feet planted, focus on your hands, focus on your voice, but with gradual, effort, learning to stay still when you're reading poetry becomes more and more second nature. And again, takes time. So sort of to recap, I guess, voice. Vary your tones. Make sure they go up and down because it's much more interesting than reading something monotone. Make sure your pacing isn't too fast or too slow. And get feedback from your peers. And focus on keeping your feet firmly planted in the ground so that you don't have any, idle nervous movements, whether it be with your feet or your hands or your arms. And learn to control them. Learn to be aware of them and be aware that they're distracting. But, it's a gradual process learning to speak in front of an audience. Things aren't always linear, and learning to conquer things that make you scared is not linear, and that's totally okay. And yeah, I think that's about wraps it up. This is true. My mother and my father met at the Greyhound bus station in the mid-'80s in Chicago. My mother, all thick glass and afro puff, came west on the train when she was 19, lived in a friend's house and cared for her children, played tambourine in a Chaka Khan cover band. My father, all sleeveless and soft-eye, ran away from home when he was 17, mimeographed communist newspapers and drew comic books, like this one, for sale, $1. My mother bought one. Love is like a comic book. It's fragile, and the best we can do is protect it in whatever clumsy ways we can. Plastic and cardboard, dark rooms and boxes. In this way, something never meant to last might find its way to another decade. Another home, an attic, a basement, intact. Love is paper. And if my parents' love was a comic book, it never saw a polyvinyl, never felt a backing. It was curled into a back pocket for a day at the park, lent to a friend, read under covers, reread hanging upside down over the back of the couch, memorized, mishandled, worn thin, staples rusted. A love like that doesn't last, but it has a good ending. Thank you guys so much for tuning into my segment for Form Fair. If you aren't already into poetry, I really suggest that you, try some writing. And if you are, I really hope that these tips help you. Or even if you aren't, I hope that you've learned more about public speaking and about getting up in front of an audience. So thank you guys for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Form Fair.